The LSAT is a test of habits, right? What can you do repeatedly? What can you do automatically? Really making sure you're building out a study plan that works for you once you've kind of gotten through the foundations and you're familiar is the best thing that you can do for yourself.
All right, hi everyone. Welcome to the 7Sage LSAT podcast. My name's Henry Ewing, and I'm joined with my co-host,
Aastha and Henry. And today, we have the very first episode of Season 2 of the 7Sage LSAT podcast, which I am stoked about. How do you feel, Henry?
Yeah, I'm very excited. In case you couldn't get enough of our voices, the 7Sage podcast, not only a delight for your ears, but your eyes too.
Cut that. No.
No, we're keeping that
So
in. We're keeping that in.
Besides the point, we've got a whole host of new episodes planned out for you guys. Last season, we did a lot of work taking you guys through day 1 to test day of the LSAT, and we have a lot more interviews, a lot more content episodes, basically more LSAT information. So I'm super excited to get started. Henry, what are we talking about today?
On today's docket, how to prepare for the LSAT. A question I think both you and I are well equipped to do, given it's our job.
I hope so at this
answer,
point.
Yeah.
There's a couple of different things. And I think one thing I want to make note of at the top of this episode before we get started is that we did an episode last season about how to study for the LSAT. And what we're looking to do with this episode is cover some of the ground that we didn't back then, right? We gave a very rudimentary kind of starting point, what to do. You heard about the LSAT today, decided you want to take it. And some of the things that we're going to be talking about today are considerations about how to study, what to study, how to really get started in the most efficient way possible. So essentially diving a little bit deeper than we did in that episode last season. So, Henry, how do you prepare for the LSAT?
We're assuming you're at this point where you have decided I need to plan to take this test. Ideally, this is happening more than just a week or two out. If you are planning on taking the test a week or two out, you've already made a misstep, I would say. A big part of deciding to take the test is knowing when you want to take it. And I think the general consensus is that more is better.
Well, the longer time you give yourself, really, the trade-off that's happening there is you can either rush your test date and try to get the test done as soon as possible. What you're going to be leaving on the table, though, are points. You're not going to give yourself the opportunity to really hit your ceiling. So the longer that you have, honestly, the higher the chances are that you're going to hit your ceiling for what score you can get. And if you're at all familiar with the LSAT, law school, that whole process, you know that even just a couple of points here and there, maybe 2 or 3 points higher, can really open up doors as far as what schools you're able to apply to, or what schools you can realistically apply to and get in, and also what scholarship opportunities that you might have. So giving yourself as much time as possible, starting early, really thinking it through about what this test means to you and what opportunities you want it to offer can go a really long way in opening up those opportunities for you.
Yeah, and it's a real beast of a test. I would say it's one of those things where it doesn't matter how smart you are much more likely to underestimate it than overestimate it.
Absolutely.
And so being willing to give yourself a lot of runway time. I know online there's a sentiment like 3 months is probably enough. We rejected that last time. We'll reject it again.
Firmly.
I personally took 6 months to study, or more than 6 months to study. What about you?
I took a little over 6 months too, and I'll say that my studying was pretty close to full-time, as close to full-time as I could possibly get it to be. So I think if I was studying anything less than full-time, it probably would have taken me even longer. So yeah, I'd say, 6-ish months was what worked for me, a little bit longer, but if I had more time, spread it out a little bit more, I definitely would have had a better time with this test. I spent a lot of time struggling with it because of the timeline I was in.
It's kind of like one of those things where it's almost too late when you decide to study, but making sure you have I don't want to say realistic, but a time frame that is going to set you up for the most success. Deciding you're going to take the test 4 weeks before is not going to reap a lot of fruit for you. And it's not going to be a good reflection of what you can do on this test. Make sure you're giving yourself a lot of time, a lot of runway time to learn the test, take the test, and really get a score that's a good reflection of your capabilities.
That's the biggest thing, yeah. We've gone over what it means to study for this test, how to be flexible, what timeline you should be looking for. Once you kind of establish that, I think it's tricky to decide what order to start working on things, how to section off your time between the 3 sections. I think that there are a lot of different schools of thought on how to do this, but my personal recommendation and something that I think is important is not neglecting one section at any point in time. Trying to keep yourself exposed to all 3 over the course of a week or over the course of 2 weeks, whatever your timeline looks like, instead of siphoning off your studying for all 3 sections in 3 different time periods. Within that, though, there are some nuances, and I think the biggest one is trying to jump into logic games as soon as you possibly can. Logic games is, famous for being the easiest section to learn or the quickest to improve on, and that's not always true for each person, but what I can say, in my own experience, the most efficient way to get better at logic games is just by practice and repetition. And so the longer you have to practice and repeat these games and go over them as many times as you need, the better off you're going to be, and the more likely it is that you're going to get as close to -0 as possible. So, Henry, when you're kind of divvying up studying time for students that are just starting out, does that hold with what you typically do? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely very wise to jump into games first. As you said, it's one of those things where it's definitely, you can improve at it the quickest. Once you get good at it, it becomes a lot more mindless. Once you get really good at games, it's one of those things where you just kind of do it and you don't think too much about it. Like, the inferences just start kind of making themselves. There's a bunch of patterns on this test that just keep repeating, and as you get better at the pattern recognition in logic games, everything just kind of falls into place. That's a lot unlike RC and LR, where you kind of just still have to try no matter what. Even when I'm doing LR, and I do LR, I almost exclusively teach LR nowadays. I still have to try pretty hard, depending on the problem. It takes a lot of mental effort. And the idea there is, even though I would consider myself, I'm a bit of an LR pro at this point, I would not want to be having to expend a bunch of effort just maintaining my LR while also expending a bunch of mental effort learning LG, right? And learning all of the new concepts of LG. I would much rather be a pro at LG, mindlessly do a section every day.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
then dive into LR and devote a lot of mental energy to that, because there's like a learning process with LG that is definitely cumbersome and difficult. But after the learning process, like after you reach that hump, the LG just goes way, way down in terms of difficulty, which is very unlike LR, where it's still fairly difficult, I would say, to do an LR problem. And RC is it's just going to be hard.
Yeah.
I would say RC is just going to be hard no matter what.
For RC, while it is hard, and I think it's notorious for being one of the harder sections to improve on, it's not something that's impossible by any means. It's just going to take a little bit more time on average. Every person's different, but on average, it's going to take a little bit more time than logic games is. I think for logic games, consistency and repetition is really the key. So when people ask me, is there anything that I should be doing every day? Is there a habit that I can build with this test to get better? What I would really recommend doing is trying to do a couple logic games every single day, foolproofing them if you're using 7Sage and that methodology. But really the best thing that you can do for yourself from the very beginning is just trying to do logic games every single day and building up that consistency. And LR and RC, whatever platform that you're using to study, go through the fundamentals. We've talked about that already on this podcast, but that's a habit that if I could go back in time and do myself, and a habit that I tell a lot of my friends who are studying for this test and students and that, do logic games. Do logic games every day. Get really good at it. Get really, really comfortable with it.
Yeah, 100%. I definitely think the order in which you should prioritize understanding would go logic games, LR, then RC.
Yeah.
It should be noted, too, because I'm sure some people are listening and they've heard tales how the logic game section is going away at some point.
Yes, those tales have happened.
We don't know when that is, and we've got guys on the inside, okay? We've got people everywhere at 7Sage, and even they don't know.
That's not... we don't have guys on the inside, Henry.
Yeah, that's good. It's good we're keeping cover.
Oh my God.
You're right, we don't have anyone on the inside.
What we do know, that what the LSAC has announced formally to everyone, is that they have said that they're going to give us a 6 months notice before any major changes to the test, including the change of the logic game section. So for at least 6 months from today, beginning of August, it's going to be the logic game section. So continue to practice them. And what I will say, my understanding is that the skills that you learn from practicing logic games in its current version will still be applicable to some extent. It's not going away so completely that, nothing that you study for logic games now is going to be helpful. And also, we don't know what we don't know. Right now, what we know is that the logic game section is going to be on the test. So you're only doing yourself a disservice if you disregard studying for logic games, anticipating that this new thing is going to come out, and then it never does before you need to take the test. So really, study logic games, study that now, and as soon as something changes, you'll hear it from us first. So we've talked a lot about, kind of the beginning steps, what to focus on, what not to focus on. The next thing is that study plan, right? I think if you go into studying for this test without some form of a study plan or a schedule or even just a to-do list, you're really doing yourself a disservice. Having consistency, having structure, I think makes a world of a difference for this test, because something I've said before on this podcast is that the LSAT is a test of habits, right? What can you do repeatedly? What can you do automatically? So really making sure you're building out a study plan that works for you once you've kind of gotten through the foundations and you're familiar is the best thing that you can do for yourself. Yeah. Now, there are 4 main components of what's going to be on the study plan and what you should be including. First one being full-length practice tests, simulating test day conditions, trying to replicate what test day is going to be like for you. Full-length sections, so working on, RC or LG or LR in isolation, not as a full-length prep test. Doing weakness-specific drills, so really taking a look at question types or difficulty levels or different things that you're struggling with and isolating that even further and just drilling those over and over again. What was the 4th one?
Review. Work?
No, review. Reviewing things. It's the most forgotten, the one that I totally forgot.
Yeah.
Review.
What's that?
Essentially, review is looking over questions that you've missed in the past, looking over concepts that you might have forgotten about or have gotten a little bit rusty on, and really dedicating time in your study to go over those things. That's the one that I think is most often overlooked, but is honestly the most important thing, especially if you're trying to score in kind of the upper ranges, higher 160s, the 170s. Reviewing your wrong answers is going to be one of the most helpful things that you can do for yourself. So, Henry, how do you kind of feel about those 4 parts?
Yeah, I think you're spot on those 4. And importantly to note, we just said those in ascending importance. A lot of people start studying, and they just start taking a bunch of PTs. They take like 5 PTs in a row. Incredibly unwise way to study.
Agreed.
Very silly, you might say.
Okay.
It really is. And the reason why is when you're doing PTs, this is like a diagnostic tool, right? It's to assess how your studying is going, how if you're improving on any weaknesses, things like that. If you just take a bunch of PTs in a row, you haven't actually done anything to improve your score, right? You're just testing yourself a bunch of times in a row. What you want to do is start out by doing your untimed work, right? Doing weakness-specific drills. Oh, I'm going to grind a bunch of sufficient assumption problems. Oh, I'm going to grind a bunch of science reading comp passages. Yeah. And then after you do that, you can take a section, see if it's going well. And then you take a PT and then confirm, oh, hey, look, I didn't miss any of these sufficient assumption problems. I did a week of studying of them. I can move on to the next thing, right? So you're constantly using the PTs just to diagnose what is happening, right? What is working? What do you need to improve on? What do you need to look at to next? You're not doing PTs in a row as a study tool. It's not a way to gain knowledge. It's a way to assess what you've learned. Same with the full-length sections, honestly. Like, they're good for studying, but I really only recommend full-length sections to people who, one, as like a smaller diagnostic tool.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Like, oh, I'm going to do a full-length section. I messed up these 5 resolve, reconcile, and explain questions. That's a good sign. I need to start studying those. Or if you are scoring in the high 160s, low 170s, you probably don't have any specific weaknesses. Yeah. And so you just need to do a bunch of problems to grind those out because you look at 10 weakening questions in a row, you'll probably get 10 of them right. As opposed to if you take an LR section, well, that's going to give you some more opportunity to look at some potentially hard problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the important thing to note with all of these different things is that the point of drilling, the point of doing full-length sections, the point of all of it is just to diagnose, correct, and then diagnose and correct, and diagnose and correct. You're just trying to do that over and over again. And if you neglect the diagnosis part and you just start practice, repeating everything that you do a million times, the chances of you improving are pretty low, right? Sure, maybe you'll improve a little bit just by sheer virtue of exposure, but every single time you go into a full-length practice test, every time you go into even a full-length section, you want to have a very specific goal that you're working towards. You're trying to improve on X, or you're trying to get better at Y. And if you're not, you can study that way, and you'll maybe improve a little bit, but it's like we were talking about earlier, that trade-off between time and your score, you're not going to hit your ceiling. I think if you're not constantly trying to re-diagnose and re-correct and re-diagnose and re-correct. I cannot emphasize that enough. If you already have a study plan or you're looking into building a study plan, see how many opportunities you're giving yourself to diagnose your mistakes. And if you don't have that many opportunities, try adding in a couple more and see what that does for your score.
Yeah. I mean, and because ultimately the goal is not to take a bunch of PTs. Right? The goal is to take a PT, click, check answers, and see a sea of green.
Yeah.
Right? That's what you want to do.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter how many times you take a PT. If you click grade and it's all red, so what? Who cares? And ultimately, you've just wasted a PT then. So what you really want to do is, how do I get to that sea of green quickly? It's not by taking PTs. It's by doing specific drills, drilling specific problems, building habits that you can, building habits and strategies that are unique to you for every single problem. That's what one of the drills I give people the most often is I say, like, hey, like, do 5 of X question type in a row. Try to think of a unifying theme that you can apply on this question type no matter what.
Yeah, that's
with
a great
RRE,
one.
maybe it's making a distinction, sufficient assumption, starting at the conclusion, any number of things. And that way, once you build that habit, you look at it on the test. It's just like muscle memory. You just instantly go into your strategy. Of course, the only way to do that, though, is to do a bunch of those problems in a row, right?
Yeah.
And really get that habit, get those repetitions in of, I'm in a sequencing game. I'm looking at leaders and followers. I'm looking at the one slot every single time. I'm looking at the final slot.
Mm-hmm. Something that I did while I was studying, which I would look over my wrong answer journal and I would take a look at patterns that I could find across question types, across difficulty levels, across styles of arguments, and notice, okay, what patterns was I making that were causing me to get these questions wrong? And every time I went to go do a full-length PT or do a full-length section, I would kind of compile a couple of those patterns and decide, today I'm going to try to get better at not missing this thing, or I'm going to try to get better at catching this thing a little bit earlier in a game.
Yeah.
The reason this came up was because somebody asked me what I did in the couple days leading up to the test. And really, that's what I did. I didn't study a whole bunch of new information. I didn't try to cram a bunch of stuff in. What I did was I took my wrong answer journal. I looked at some last couple patterns that I could find. And I repeated like 5 things over and over again to myself right before I went into the test of mistakes I didn't want to make or things I wanted to be very conscious of. And the sooner you're able to start compiling that list and the sooner you're able to take a look at the things you're doing over and over again that's causing you to miss questions, the sooner you can diagnose, the sooner you can correct and repeat that entire process.
Yeah, I think the final metric we need to touch on is how many hours a day should you study?
Yeah.
There's no, well, I was about to say, there's no right amount. There's not a right amount for everyone.
Yeah.
That being said, there are some reasonable goals that you could hit or not hit. First of all, if you only have an hour to study a day, you only have an hour to study. And there's nothing you can do about that. So it's not like a bad thing. By the way, an hour of study every day is great.
If you do that consistently, I would take that over an 8-hour study day once a week. Like, absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. Daily work is far better than long chunks of work and then long breaks in between. Mm-hmm. So I'll gladly take even 30 minutes a day over a 4-hour brick on Sunday and a 4-hour brick on Wednesday.
I totally agree.
Just because, as you pointed out, we were talking about how this is a test of habits, so you need to keep building those habits over time. Mm-hmm. By every day, you're doing a little bit of LSAT, a little bit of conditional logic, a little bit of causal logic.
Even if it's just like, let's say hypothetically, all you have in a week is a 4-hour block on Sunday and a 4-hour block on Wednesday. If you can just do a logic game every day throughout the week or review one lesson every day throughout the week, just doing some exposure to LSAT content consistently, you're going to be way better off. The other thing that I talk to a lot of people about is full-time studying and what full-time studying looks like. I know quite a few people who maybe they're in summer break in between school or they took some time off of work to really dedicate to studying. What do you do in a full day? Do you study 8 hours a day? Probably not. I'm sure there are some people who can do that, and I certainly tried to do that when I was studying, but what you're going to find is after, on average, what I see at least is between 4 to 5 hours of studying, you're really getting diminishing returns on the rest of the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
And there's no magic number that will work for everyone, but even if you are trying to study full time, I would really just try to take it day by day and see how much work can you do productively. How long can you keep your mind sharp? How long are you working efficiently? Are you getting bored? Are you getting tired? Are you glossing over the words on the paper? Are you missing questions that you probably wouldn't have missed in more ideal conditions? Well, it's time just to stop studying. Right? I'd much rather you slow down on your schedule a little bit than try to do 8-10-hour days of the LSAT. And half of the time that you're spending studying is super unproductive because you're tired. This is a very mentally exhausting test. It takes a lot of your attention. It takes a lot of your energy. And if you try to cram all of the studying in over really, really long stretches of time, you might feel like, I don't know, a super productive LSAT studier, but you're really just doing yourself a disservice. Do you have any stories of students who try to overstudy? What happened to them? Anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, me, right? Like, I definitely burned out going into my first test, and the test I ended up doing really well on was one in which I maybe did an hour a day, if that.
Really?
Going into it. Yeah, and I just saw massive improvements. And I think a lot of it was just due to burnout. It wasn't like I didn't know any information at that point. I think I was just overloading myself, stressing myself out.
Yeah.
And if you really think about the effectiveness of an hour of studying, that first hour is so powerful because you have full attention. You are willing to just go at the problem. But as you point out, you get these diminishing returns where, like, hour 5, I guarantee you're not paying attention like you were.
Oh, absolutely. 1. Absolutely.
And it's very silly. It's like, yeah, you are maybe making some progress, but you're paying so much. You're paying such a heavy price, and you're risking burnout down the end, which is the worst kind of thing you can run into.
Yeah.
I've clients that have just been clearly burned out. You just have to tell them, like, stop studying. You need to stop studying. You need to take a break. It's not going to help you. There's no through burnout. You just have to stop. Yeah, really though, there's no like, oh, I'm gonna get unburned out by burning myself out more. Now, of course, it's anecdotal.
No,
but
I think it's so true though.
Yeah. I've seen it a lot of times though, where a lot of my clients right now who are scoring really highly, it's not like they're studying a crazy amount nowadays. They are maybe doing an hour. Now, of course, that means they have a lot of time under their belt, like many months of consistent practice. But it's not like the way they're achieving their high scores right now is through 8-hour sessions. They're taking, 2 weeks of vacation just so they can grind. No, it's not going to help you.
No, it's just not the most ideal way to study for this test. If you're looking for what I think is the best way, most productive way, and the way that's most conducive to, like, protecting your sanity, right? And really just reaching your ceiling with what you can do with this test, trying to overdo it, trying to believe that you're better than burnout is not the way to go. And so, and I totally get it. I think when I was studying, if I listened to somebody tell me this, I'd be like, yeah, whatever for other people, but not for me. I thought I was better than burnout. I really did. And then it got to the point where I was going to take the test. I was registered. I was ready to go. And I was so severely burnt out that I was performing nowhere close to what my ceiling was for this test. And I did something very similar when I ended up retaking it, or just moving my test date. I pared down on my studying a ton. I did a lot of drills. I did a lot of time on the analytics page at 7Sage trying to figure out where my weaknesses were. And that's what ultimately helped me get to my final score. And the score that I was really comfortable was close to my ceiling.
Yeah. And just to mention, too, like, let's say you can be a full-time studier. You don't have a job. You have summer break. And you do really feel like you want to study all day. Make sure you take long breaks in between sessions. Morning session, 2.5 hours, something like that. Long break. Afternoon session, 2.5 hours. Long break, maybe till the next day. Or at least take a couple hours to reassess, to go do something you like to do, unless you like studying the LSAT. Yeah, potentially.
Hopefully.
Develop a hobby. It's good. It's good. You need to have what you don't want to do is have those icebreakers in law school where they ask you, like, what's your hobby? What do you mean, what's my hobby?
So honestly, just to kind of recap the most important things that I would want y'all to take away from this episode, and what I really want to reiterate on what we're going to talk about more throughout the season. Giving yourself time, right? Giving yourself that opportunity. You have no idea how many people I've talked to recently. Right now it's early August, and applications are going to start opening up soon. People are really trying to cram in this test as quick as they possibly can. And pretty much everyone that I've talked to who's trying to cram into a fall test date wishes they started a little bit earlier. You're never going to regret starting earlier to study for this test. Thinking about the priorities of when you're studying, how you're studying, what sections you're focusing on, trying to hit logic games as soon as you possibly can. And then when you're actually building your study plan, which you should build a study plan. You should not just try to wing it. Really prioritizing, reviewing your work, building out time in your week to review wrong answers from the past, to foolproof games from the past, doing those drills, doing the full-length sections, and prioritizing full-length PTs last and only as a form of diagnosis.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I have to add, though, just to get rid of the whole, just to add that, that little caveat.
Oh, of
which
course.
is, if you're in school, don't trade your grades for a good LSAT score. So what you want to do is you want to give yourself a longer run time of studying the test. And by longer, too, it's very important to mention, it's like, you can start studying when you're a sophomore. You can start studying when you're a freshman. Just don't make it your life. Yeah. Right? Just get acquainted with the concepts. Start getting acquainted with the idea of sufficient and necessary. You don't need to do a bunch of deep studying as a freshman, but getting used to the ideas of sufficient and necessary, getting used to the idea of causal reasoning, and living a couple years just like thinking in that. Like, if I could introduce myself to conditionals as a freshman, my life would have been so much easier.
Absolutely.
It really would have been easier. If I could introduce myself to causal reasoning as a freshman,
Absolutely.
my life on the LSAT would have been so much easier. Now, that doesn't mean I'd be studying like 2 hours every single day during, college, at the prime of your life, until you become an LSAT tutor. It doesn't mean you'd be doing 2 hours every day, but you do a little bit here and there. You can study as you want, and giving yourself that long run time. That way, when you do eventually have to take the test, it's not like grind time. Oh my God, I've got 5 finals, and I need to take the May LSAT. Is there a May LSAT? There isn't a May LSAT.
No, I completely agree. You want to really just make sure you're giving yourself the time so you're not having to cram for finals and try to cram for the LSAT, neither of which are ideal, and sacrificing your GPA for that LSAT score. If you time this well and you plan ahead and you really give yourself the opportunity to study for this at the pace that works best for you, there won't have to be a trade-off, right? You can really have them both. So I guess the moral of the story is start now. Start yesterday.
Start now.
Start as soon as you
start
can.
Yesterday. Yeah.
And you'll be
we would love it if you
thankful for
started with us at 7Sage Prep Plus.
Of course.
With access to live instructors.
Besides the point, we have a ton of other great episodes lined up, a lot of interviews lined up for the rest of the season, and I'm super excited to be sharing it with you all in video format now. So thanks for
I'm
listening.
excited to start popping off. It'll be great. All right, guys.
Bye.
I'll see you soon.
See you next week.